What is up, my spooky mates of YouTube? My name is Marcel from Aussie Horror, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the sequel to Return of the Living Dead, Return of the Living Dead Part 2, and why I actually think this film is kind of decent. So if that sounds good to you, let's get into the video. My very first video on this channel was a review of Return of the Living Dead, and it is obviously a classic movie. There's nothing really wrong with this movie. It's both funny, it's a little scary, it's got some cheap gore in it as well. Overall, it's a classic, a cult classic 1980s horror movie. But where I think people go wrong is in their instant dismissal of Return of the Living Dead Part 2. People usually skip this one and just go to Return of the Living Dead Part 3, which is a completely different movie. It's got a completely different feel. Whereas Return of the Living Dead Part 2 is just like a rehashing of the first movie. You know, it's got James Karen and Tom Matthews back in different roles, but they're effectively playing the same character almost. But I actually prefer this one to the original, and I'll tell you why. This movie is funnier than the original. It's got more gore than the original. And it's a more interesting movie to watch than the original.
Reborn. Return of the Living Dead, Part 2.
The issue that I think people have with Return of the Living Dead Part 2 is the fact that it does feel like a kid's movie in some ways. The focus on the child character is apparent. Like, you watch this movie and you go, alright, so this was meant to be a movie focused on that, and then it's sort of like they added, you know, James Karen and Tom Matthews back into the movie. But I actually don't mind it. I still think that the movie, if not better than the... I still think the movie is, if not better than the original, certainly it's equal. And there's a few different reasons for that. The first of which is that it's a gorier film overall. Now, the first movie wasn't the goriest movie around, but the second one, there is quite a bit more to it. There's that scene in the hospital in particular where they shoot the zombie in half with a shotgun and it's just like crawling around and you can see the spine sticking out and moving around. It's a really gnarly practical effect and it still looks fantastic to this day. The other reason why I think it's as good as the original is that there's more of a variety in locations. See, the first movie, you only really had the medical supply store, the graveyard, and then the funeral home or the mortuary. But this one, you've got the hospital, you've got the neighborhood, you've got the graveyard, you've got inside the tomb. You've got a bunch of different locations here, and it just has more variety to it. And the third reason is I find that it's a funnier movie overall. This one does lean a little bit more towards the comedy and the comedic. So there's this beautiful scene. So there's this funny scene where the zombie's like coming out of the ground and it sticks its hand out and it gets trodden on and it's like complaining about it, and then it moves its hand back when another zombie walks past. It's a tiny comedic touch, but it does add quite a bit to the movie, and overall the movie is funnier than the first one. Honestly, if you liked Return of the Living Dead Part 1, you should really give a chance to Return of the Living Dead Part 2. This movie is basically a rehash of the first one with just more gore, and it's got a slightly more comedic tone to it. Return of the Living Dead is a good balance between horror and comedy, whereas Return of the Living Dead Part 2, it veers a little more into the comedic territory. And I think that's where a lot of people dislike it in comparison to Return of the Living Dead Part 1. Another element I think people dislike about Return of the Living Dead Part 2 is the storyline, is Jesse's storyline, played by Michael Kenworthy. You're following around him basically in this, and it just gives the movie an almost like a kid's movie kind of feel to it.
Jesse will be the first to know.
Except it obviously isn't a kid's movie. And I saw this really interesting article basically explaining how Return of the Living Dead Part 2 was almost a kid's movie. I don't know how they would have turned a zombie movie into a kid's movie, but if you watch Return of the Living Dead Part 2 and you sort of notice the beats in the storyline and all of that and the overall silliness, I can understand how they could have turned this into a kid's movie. But there's just too much gore, there's too much swearing, although there's no nudity like there is in Return of the Living Dead Part 1. And another thing I think people dislike about Return of the Living Dead Part 2 is that it doesn't have the chaotic, punky energy of the first film. The first film is a cult classic for a variety of reasons. It's just a great movie, it's a great horror comedy, the writing is exceptional, and the chemistry between the cast is exceptional as well. Return of the Living Dead doesn't really have any of that, but it does have the chemistry. James Karen and Tom Matthews return in this, and they're both in the main roles of the movie, except they're both playing grave robbers in this one, which is kind of like a really funny, ironic twist to it. Their chemistry makes this entire movie. It's just as good as it was in the first movie, if not better, because this is obviously the second time they're working together. And if you liked that element to the first movie, you're going to love this movie as well, because it's essentially the same. They are playing different characters technically, but they kind of feel like exactly the same characters. And they even make a joke about how they've been here before. They break the fourth wall. It's a great little scene when they're in the car driving away. Overall though, I can see why people dislike it because it is basically a rehash of the original, but I prefer this one because it's gorier, it's got more of a comedic slant to it, and I think all the jokes really do work. And all in all, I think it's just the 80s vibe that I really love about it. You just don't get that vibe with movies nowadays. You get movies that are set in the 1980s or they have that 1980s aesthetic, but it just doesn't work, whereas it does work beautifully here. The soundtrack is different to Return of the Living Dead Part 1 as well. This has like a bunch of punk, horror punk and death rock, whereas this is just your standard 1980s rock and metal, which I absolutely adore for basically the same reasons as I adored the soundtrack for Return of the Living Dead Part 1. They're both like my personal soundtracks anyway, so it gets massive points for me in both those fields. Overall, the acting, although cheesy, is what you'd expect for a 1980s horror film. James Karen and Tom Matthews have excellent chemistry. This time they play grave robbers, which is sort of ironic considering what happens to them in the first movie. They end up becoming zombies and now they're robbing from the graves. I don't know, it's just a sort of a little ironic twist. Although a thing that bothers me about this movie is they get hit with the trioxane gas and become zombies, but Brenda, who's Joey's girlfriend, she's in the same graveyard with them and she doesn't turn into a zombie, and clearly she's surrounded by the gas as well. So there's just that little inconsistency there that, you know, that always has bugged me, because I'm like, I really didn't want them to turn into zombies in this movie. I wanted them to like last the entire movie, but I guess a lot of the comedy comes from them just dealing with this whole situation again, and I've always liked that scene as well. I know this is a relatively minor point, but the cover art for this one in particular is fantastic. I love the design for it. It's one of the best cover arts in the horror genre. There we go, I'll just show you there. It looks fantastic. It looks very similar to the Fright Night cover. I'll put that up somewhere over there so you'll be able to see it and compare it with it. But yeah, love the artwork for this one. Ultimately, in the overall canon of horror films, I do think Return of the Living Dead Part 2 is unfairly criticized. But in saying that, I do understand why people dislike it as well. It is way too similar to the original, as I've said before, and it has a different vibe than the original despite being the same movie, if that makes sense. Anyways, what's your opinion on Return of the Living Dead Part 2? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Let me know in the comments below. I can't wait to hear what you guys have to say, and if you would like to see some coverage on Return of the Living Dead Part 3, let me know in the comments below as well. I love that movie as well, but it is a completely different beast than the first two Return of the Living Deads. Anyways, until the next video, my name is Marcel with Aussie Horror, and I will catch you guys around.